April 17th, 1945. Apeldoorn, the Netherlands. Sergeant Herb Pike of the 48th Highlanders of Canada entered a town that, from a distance, almost looked untouched by war. The houses were still standing. The streets were not buried under rubble. There were no burning tanks, no shattered rooftops, no fresh craters tearing through the road. At first glance, it looked like the town had somehow escaped the worst of Europe's nightmare. But then Pike looked closer, and he realized something was terribly wrong. The people were lining the roads in huge numbers. Hundreds at first, then thousands. They waved small Dutch flags that had been hidden for years. They cheered as the Canadian vehicles moved through the streets. Some smiled, some cried. Some tried to shout, but their voices barely came out. They were celebrating liberation, but their bodies looked like they had already lost the war. Pike was only 23 years old. He had already fought through Sicily, Italy, and across the Rhine. He had seen men die. He had seen cities burn. He had seen what artillery could do to a human body. But what he saw in those faces stayed with him differently. Women who looked elderly were barely in their 30s. Children stood on legs so thin their bones seemed to press against their skin. Men leaned against walls because standing upright took too much strength. One civilian reached toward a Canadian truck and collapsed before his hand could touch it. The Dutch were cheering their liberators, and the liberators were watching a nation starve. Herb Pike would remember those faces for the rest of his life. Not the flags, not the noise, not the victory, the faces. He would later say the civilians were in terrible condition. Their health had been destroyed. They had survived on tulip bulbs and whatever scraps they could find. But what Pike did not yet know, what no Canadian soldier entering the Netherlands that spring fully understood, was that Apeldoorn was not the worst of it. Not even close. Apeldoorn was in the east, where farms still existed, where some food had survived, where the famine had reached people but had not completely consumed them. To the west, behind German lines, in Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague and Utrecht, nearly 3 million people were trapped in a hunger so severe that around 20,000 had already died, and more were dying every single day. The Canadians had reached the edge of a catastrophe. The heart of it was still miles away, behind enemy guns, beyond the reach of normal armies, and almost out of time. This is the story of what Canadian soldiers discovered when they entered the Netherlands in the final weeks of the Second World War, and what they did when they realized that winning the war would not be enough, because the people they had come to liberate needed more than freedom. They needed food, and they needed it before liberation arrived too late. If this story deserves to be remembered, leave a like and subscribe. It helps these forgotten moments of history reach the people who still care about them. To understand what the Canadians walked into, you have to go back 7 months, because the disaster did not begin with the arrival of the Canadian Army. It began with an act of courage, an act of resistance by ordinary Dutch people, an act meant to help defeat the Nazis, and instead, it almost condemned an entire nation to death. September 17th, 1944. The Dutch government in exile, operating from London, sent a message to the people of the occupied Netherlands. The instruction was simple: stop the trains, go on strike, shut the railways down. At that exact moment, the Allies were launching Operation Market Garden, one of the most ambitious attacks of the war. Thousands of airborne troops were being dropped into the Netherlands. The goal was to seize key bridges, break through the German defenses, cross the Rhine, and open the road into Germany. If the Dutch railway workers refused to run the trains, German reinforcements would be delayed. German supplies would stall. German troops would be trapped. It might shorten the war by months. The Dutch railway workers answered immediately. Across the country, around 30,000 workers walked away from their posts. Trains stopped moving. Stations went silent. Rail lines that had carried German troops and equipment suddenly became useless. The Dutch people had made their choice. They risked everything on the belief that liberation was coming, but liberation did not come. Operation Market Garden failed at Arnhem. The bridge was not captured. British paratroopers were overwhelmed. The Allied breakthrough into Germany never happened, and the Dutch railway workers, who had exposed themselves in the name of freedom, were left behind inside an occupied country, a country still controlled by a Nazi regime that had just been publicly humiliated. Remember the date, September 27th, 1944, because on that day, Friedrich Christiansen, the German military commander in the Netherlands, signed an order that would turn hunger into a weapon. In retaliation for the railway strike, the Germans blocked food transportation from the agricultural east to the heavily populated west. No grain, no potatoes, no milk, no meat, nothing. The Western Netherlands included Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, and Utrecht. It held nearly half the population of the country in a dense urban region with very little farmland of its own. Those cities survived because food came in from outside, and overnight, that lifeline was cut. The embargo was meant as punishment, a warning, a message to the Dutch people that resistance had a price. But the railway workers did not surrender. They refused to return. The strike continued through October, then November, then winter. By the time the Germans partially lifted the embargo, the damage had already been done. The canals that could have carried food froze in one of the coldest winters in decades. Roads became nearly impossible to use. Fuel was gone. Transport systems collapsed. And 3 million people began to starve in the middle of occupied Europe. What followed would become one of the darkest chapters in Dutch history, the Hunger Winter. And when the Canadians finally saw what it had done, many of them were never the same. Some veterans barely spoke about it again. Others could never stop speaking about it. But before the Canadians could reach the starving cities behind the German lines, something had to happen that no Allied commander wanted to risk. They would have to negotiate with the enemy, not after the war, not after surrender, but while the fighting was still happening. And the first step would not come from a famous general. It would come from 2 Canadian officers in a jeep, carrying a white bedsheet as a flag, driving straight into German territory with no guarantee they would come back alive. By November 1944, the Western Netherlands had entered what the Dutch would call the Hunger Winter. The Hunger Winter. But even that name does not fully explain what happened. In Amsterdam, a city of hundreds of thousands, the official daily ration fell to 600 calories, then 500. Then, by February 1945, roughly 340 calories a day. For an adult, for a mother, for a child. A thin piece of bread. A bowl of watery soup made from sugar beets. Sometimes less. That was supposed to keep a person alive for an entire day. To understand how little that is, remember that a Canadian soldier could receive more than 3,000 calories a day. What a starving civilian in Amsterdam might receive in a week, a soldier could eat in a single day of marching and fighting. And as the food disappeared, people began doing things that would have seemed impossible only months earlier. Families scraped wallpaper from the walls and boiled the paste because there was flour in the glue. They pulled wooden floors apart and burned the boards because there was no fuel left. They ate dogs, cats, rats. In Rotterdam, people chased birds for food. In The Hague, women stood in long lines for soup made from tulip bulbs. Tulip bulbs that had once been stored for spring planting had become one of the last sources of calories left in the city. They were bitter. They were hard to digest. They made people sick. But they kept people alive for one more day. And one more day was all anyone could think about. Across the Netherlands, people began the desperate journeys known as hunger treks. Thousands, often women, walked out of the cities toward the countryside. Some walked on foot. Some pushed bicycles with no tires. They carried anything they could trade: a wedding ring for potatoes, a silver spoon for bread, a family clock for a small sack of grain. They walked 20, 30, sometimes 40 kilometers in freezing weather. Some came back with food. Some never came back at all. They collapsed along roads. They froze in ditches. They died with empty bags in their hands. And even the farmers who wanted to help were overwhelmed. There were too many hungry people, too many open hands, too many children. And German authorities were still taking whatever they could find. Tens of thousands of children were evacuated from the western cities into the countryside. Mothers sent their sons and daughters away to live with strangers because those strangers might have food. Imagine that choice: keeping your child at home and watching them fade, or sending them away and hoping someone else could keep them alive. And while this was happening, while civilians starved in their own streets, the man who ruled the occupied Netherlands sat down to Christmas dinner. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Reich Commissioner of the Netherlands, celebrated Christmas in 1944 at his official residence near The Hague. His menu included multiple kinds of meat and ice cream. Outside his gates, people were eating tulip bulbs. He knew what was happening. He had helped create it, and he ate. But the hardest part of this story is that the Germans were not the only ones who knew. The Allies knew too. Dutch officials had been warning London for months. Queen Wilhelmina had written personally to King George and President Roosevelt, pleading for food relief or military action. Prince Bernhard had pushed Eisenhower directly, but the answer came back again and again. The war came first. Germany had to be defeated. Every truck, every aircraft, every gallon of fuel was needed for the military campaign. Sending food behind enemy lines was dangerous. It could fall into German hands. It could feed enemy soldiers. The strategy was clear. The Dutch would have to wait. So they waited. Through January, through February, through March. And every week, the number of dead increased. By April, the bread ration in some areas had fallen to a few hundred grams per week. Less than one loaf divided across several days. Bodies were placed inside churches because the frozen ground was too hard to dig graves, and there was no fuel for hearses. In Amsterdam, the death rate rose to many times its pre-war level. The Dutch resistance sent a message through secret channels. Amsterdam had bread for 5 days. After that, nothing. This was the country the 1st Canadian Army was moving toward. Not a normal battlefield. Not just a place of roads, bridges, rivers, and towns. This was a race against starvation. For the Canadians, victory no longer meant only defeating German units. It meant reaching millions of civilians before hunger finished what war had started, and they were still fighting. Town by town, canal by canal, street by street. Canadian soldiers were still being killed in April 1945, even as the famine grew worse behind the German lines. The men who had already entered eastern Netherlands had seen hunger. They had seen hollow cheeks, thin arms, children begging for anything from a soldier's pocket. But the West was something else. The West was behind enemy defenses, and reaching it would require an idea so strange that it almost sounded impossible. An army would have to ask its enemy for permission to feed the civilians that enemy was starving. The first move came in April 1945. The 1st Canadian Army, under General Harry Crerar, had become the largest army ever commanded by a Canadian. It included Canadian Corps, a British Corps, a Polish armored division, and other Allied units attached at different moments. Its front stretched from the Channel coast to the North Sea. In those final weeks, one of its greatest missions was the liberation of the Netherlands. But this campaign was unlike France. In France, the Canadians had used artillery, air power, tanks, and overwhelming force. In the Netherlands, that could become a disaster. The land was flat and full of canals. Civilians were everywhere. A single artillery barrage could kill the very people the Canadians were trying to save. Worse, the Germans had flooded large areas of farmland and were believed to be ready to destroy the dikes along the North Sea coast. If the dikes were blown, the sea would pour into Western Holland. Thousands could drown. Entire towns could disappear underwater. So the Canadians fought carefully, slowly, painfully. They were liberating a country where one wrong attack could turn salvation into catastrophe. Every town told them the same thing. The people were grateful, but they were starving. On April 9th, Lieutenant W.J. Trump and Trooper W.H.G. Ritchie of the Fort, Gary Horse entered a small town east of the IJssel River. Dutch civilians rushed out, waving, crying, laughing, trying to touch the men who had finally arrived. Then the soldiers saw the children. They were not simply thin. They looked consumed from within. Trump reached into his ration kit and handed chewing gum to a child. That simple moment, a Canadian soldier leaning down from his vehicle to give gum to a Dutch child, became one of the remembered images of liberation. But the photograph could not show the rest of the war happening nearby. German paratroopers and SS units were still fighting. Some were teenagers, some were from shattered formations, but they fought with the fury of men who knew the war was nearly over and still refused to let go. Canadians were still dying. On April 15th, near Apeldoorn, a German artillery shell killed Private Harry Brought. The same shelling destroyed the home of a Dutch woman named Nelly Vandenberg. She survived. Harry did not. After the war, Nelly wrote to Harry's widow, Ruth, in Canada. She told her where her husband had died and how he had fallen. Two women, separated by an ocean, connected by one shell. They kept writing to each other for decades. That is what this liberation created. Not only history, not only military records, human bonds. A Canadian soldier dies liberating a Dutch town. A Dutch woman whose house was destroyed in the same attack writes to his wife thousands of miles away. And for 40 years, they remain connected. That is not diplomacy. That is memory. 2 days after Harry Brought was killed, Canadian forces liberated Apeldoorn. The streets filled with tens of thousands of people. But the celebration was unlike anything the soldiers had imagined. The Canadians were not just greeted as liberators. They were seen as the first source of food in months. Soldiers began giving away whatever they had: chocolate bars, biscuits, canned meat, chewing gum, cigarettes. Rations meant for fighting men were handed to civilians who weighed less than the packs on the soldiers' backs. For children who had lived on tulip soup and sugar beet pulp, a piece of chocolate from a Canadian soldier was almost unimaginable. A young Dutch girl named Lisbeth lived in Apeldoorn. When a unit of the Royal Canadian Corps of Signals set up nearby, the soldiers adopted her in their own way. They made her an honorary captain. They gave her insignia and shoulder flashes, and her mother sewed them onto a blue sweater. Lisbeth wore that sweater constantly. She kept it for more than 7 decades, through adulthood, through marriage, through a life that carried her far beyond the war. Eventually, she donated it to a Canadian military museum, still holding on to the memory of the men who had arrived with food, kindness, and freedom. But every Canadian in Apeldoorn understood something by the end of that first week. The people they were feeding were the fortunate ones. As terrible as hunger was in the east, there were still farms. There were still traces of supply. There were still people strong enough to cheer in the streets. The west was different. The west was trapped behind the Grebbe line, the German defensive position running through the heart of the Netherlands. Behind that line were Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, and Utrecht. 3 million civilians. No fuel, no medicine, almost no food. And between them and the Canadians stood the German 25th Army, around 100,000 soldiers. If the Canadians fought their way through, it could take weeks. The Dutch did not have weeks. If the Allies bombed and shelled the German defenses, they could kill starving civilians or trigger the destruction of the dikes. The Canadians needed another path, and on April 26th, 2 men tried to create one. Captain Farley Mowat was 24 years old. He had been at war since he was a teenager. He had landed in Sicily with the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment. He had survived brutal fighting in Italy, including Ortona, one of the bloodiest urban battles Canada had ever fought. He was known as a sharp intelligence officer. He was also known as unpredictable. Mowat wrote constantly: letters, notes, journals, observations. After the war, he would become one of Canada's most famous authors, known for stories about wolves, whales, wilderness, and the Arctic. But in April 1945, he was not thinking about books. He was thinking about 3 million starving civilians. A message had come through the Dutch resistance. It was uncertain, incomplete, and dangerous. It suggested that the German commander in Western Holland, General Johannes Blaskowitz, might be willing to discuss the food crisis. No official pass, no guarantee, no assurance it was not a trap. At Canadian intelligence headquarters, the message was debated and treated with suspicion. It could be real. It could be bait. It could be a mistake. But Major Ken Cotham, a British-born officer fluent in German, and Captain Farley Mowat decided it was worth the risk. They took one more man with them, Sergeant Doc MacDonald, Mowat's orderly. 3 men, 1 jeep, no protection except a white bedsheet tied to the front. On the morning of April 26th, they drove toward the German lines. Think about that image. The war was still being fought. Canadian and German soldiers were still killing each other nearby. Artillery could still fall. Machine guns could still open up at any moment. And 3 Canadians in an open jeep, carrying a homemade white flag, drove directly toward the German 25th Army. Mowat later said he expected to be shot at any second. He did not believe they would pass the first checkpoint. But they did. Cotham spoke German with confidence and authority. He acted like a man who belonged there, even though every second could have exposed them. The sentries were uncertain, but the message referenced General Blaskowitz, and that was enough to make them hesitate. They let the Canadians through. At the second checkpoint, it happened again. At the third, the Germans gave them a motorcycle escort. Now the Canadians were not just entering enemy lines, they were being escorted deeper into them. By nightfall, the jeep reached the headquarters of the German 25th Army, a guarded bunker complex. Mowat and Kotum were taken inside to meet General Blaskowitz. Exactly what was said in that room has been told in different ways. Mowat himself retold the story many times, and the details shifted over the years, as they often do when men remember moments that were half strategy and half madness. But the outcome is clear. Late that night, Kotum and Mowat sent word back to Canadian headquarters. They had secured an understanding. The Germans would allow food relief into Western Holland. Aircraft dropping food would not be fired upon. Truck convoys would be allowed through. Mowat later said he expected either a medal or a court-martial. He got neither. What he and Kotum did not fully know was that their dangerous, unofficial mission was happening alongside larger negotiations at the highest levels of command. And those talks were just as fragile. On April 28th, in the Dutch village of Achterveld, inside Canadian-controlled territory, Allied representatives met German officers to discuss emergency food relief. The issue was simple. Millions were starving. The war was almost over. Would the Germans allow food in? But the German officers at the meeting did not have final authority. They could only report back to the man who did. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the same man who had ruled the occupied Netherlands, the same man tied to the food embargo, the same man who had eaten well while the Dutch starved. The decision to feed millions of civilians depended partly on the man most associated with their suffering. 2 days later, on April 30th, General Walter Bedell-Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, met Seyss-Inquart directly. Bedell-Smith was not known for softness. He made the stakes brutally clear. If the Germans refused to cooperate, there would be consequences. Seyss-Inquart tried to appear unmoved, but in the end, he agreed. Whether he acted from fear, calculation, or because he was already thinking about his future war crimes trial, the result was the same. Allied aircraft could drop food into designated zones. German anti-aircraft guns would not fire. Truck convoys could follow. But there was one terrifying problem. An agreement on paper is not the same thing as an agreement on the ground. No one knew if German flak crews, nervous sentries, teenage soldiers, or isolated commanders would obey. The Allies were about to send large aircraft at extremely low altitude over German-controlled territory. If one gun crew ignored the agreement, the aircraft could be torn apart. Before the formal approval was fully settled, one Lancaster bomber was sent to test the danger. Its name was Bad Penny. The pilot was Flying Officer Robert Upcott, only 22 years old, from Windsor, Ontario. Most of the crew were Canadian. On April 29, 1945, they took off on one of the strangest missions Bomber Command had ever flown. Their bomb bay was full, but not with bombs. It carried flour, canned meat, dried vegetables, chocolate, and other emergency food supplies. Where destruction had once been loaded, survival now sat packed in sacks and boxes. There were no parachutes. The food would simply be dropped. That meant the aircraft had to fly dangerously low, low enough so the supplies would not be destroyed on impact, low enough that the crew could see the land, low enough that German gunners could not miss if they chose to fire. The orders were clear. Stay inside the corridor. Fly at low altitude. Drop the food. Do not attack. Do not deviate. And understand that the Germans have not yet formally signed the final agreement. That detail mattered. On that morning, the ceasefire protecting the food drops existed more as a fragile understanding than a guarantee. If one German anti-aircraft crew decided not to honor it, Bad Penny would be finished. As the Lancaster crossed the Dutch coast, the crew could see the flak guns. They could see the barrels following them. One airman on a later mission described the feeling as being watched by someone aiming a rifle who had not yet decided whether to pull the trigger. But the guns stayed silent. Bad Penny reached the drop zone. The bomb bay doors opened. Food fell from the sky. Below, Dutch civilians who had heard rumors from Radio Oranje stared upward in disbelief. They had been told food might come, but after months of hunger, hope itself had become dangerous. Now sacks were falling from an Allied bomber, not explosives. Food. Bad Penny turned back toward England. The message came through. Mission accomplished. Within hours, Operation Manna expanded. Hundreds of Lancasters followed, dropping food into the starving Netherlands. British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand and Polish air crews flew sortie after sortie at altitudes so low they could read messages laid out on rooftops and fields. Thank you. God bless you. Many thanks. Boys. The same kind of aircraft that had dropped fire over Germany were now dropping flour over Holland. The same bomb aimers, who had once lined up targets for destruction, now lined up food for starving civilians. Same crews, same machines, a completely different purpose. On May the 1st, the Americans joined with Operation Chowhound. B-17 flying fortresses, built to fly high over enemy territory, came in at only a few hundred feet. Their bomb bays were packed with ration boxes. Each ration package contained thousands of calories. For someone living on a few hundred calories a day, one ration box could hold more food than they had eaten in a week. And that created another tragedy. Some people were too hungry to wait for proper distribution. They opened packages and ate immediately. Some became violently ill. Some died. Not because the food came too late, but because it came suddenly. After months of starvation, the body can be shocked by food, especially rich food. The heart can fail. The body that has fought to survive hunger can be overwhelmed by the very thing meant to rescue it. This is one of the cruelest details of the hunger winter. For some, salvation arrived in a form their bodies could no longer endure. And there was another problem. Dropping food was only the first step. The supplies landed in open fields and designated zones, but the people who needed them most were not always able to reach them. The elderly, the bedridden, children too weak to walk, families hidden in rooms with no strength left to leave. In some cities, it took days for food dropped from the air to reach civilians. In Amsterdam and The Hague, people kept dying even as supplies sat only a few kilometers away. There were not enough trucks, not enough fuel, not enough organization left. The air crews knew it. The planners knew it. The airdrops were saving lives, but they could not feed 3 million people alone. The Netherlands did not just need planes. It needed roads. It needed trucks. It needed convoys. It needed food carried directly into occupied cities, in quantities large enough to matter. And that meant something almost unbelievable. Canadian drivers would have to take unarmed trucks through German lines, past soldiers who had not yet fully surrendered, into starving cities still under enemy control. The operation was called Faust. On May 2, 1945, hundreds of trucks started moving. Lieutenant Colonel E.A. de Geer established his headquarters only a few hundred yards from the German front line, close enough to hear the enemy, close enough that one broken truce could have turned the whole operation into a massacre. His job was to organize one of the largest humanitarian road convoys of the war. The trucks came from the Royal Canadian Army Service Corps. These were vehicles that had carried ammunition, fuel, and rations through France, Belgium, and the Rhineland. Now they would carry food into German-held territory. The route crossed near Wageningen and Rhenen. The trucks were unarmed. They carried white flags, and they drove past German soldiers who were still technically the enemy. At 7:30 in the morning on May 2nd, the first trucks rolled across the line. Soon, the operation grew rapidly. Truck after truck, convoy after convoy, hundreds of vehicles moved food toward the starving West. Around 1,000 tons of food a day. The drivers were mostly young Canadians. Many had driven under fire in Normandy and the Scheldt. They knew what danger looked like. They knew how to keep a truck moving when roads were broken and shells were falling. But nothing prepared them for the silence of Western Holland. The first thing they noticed was that everything had stopped. No cars, no fuel, no bicycles. Many had been confiscated. Trams sat dead on their tracks. Streets that should have been full of life were nearly empty because people no longer had the strength to walk. Then, the drivers saw the civilians. In the east, they had seen hunger. In the west, they saw something beyond hunger. People sitting against walls because they could not stand. People lying in doorways. People staring at the trucks as if they were seeing something impossible. Not joy, not even relief at first. Disbelief, as if the trucks were a dream, as if food arriving on wheels belonged to a world that no longer existed. The children were the hardest to witness. Canadian soldiers, many barely older than boys themselves, stood in the backs of trucks and passed food down into crowds that moved with desperate need. Mothers lifted infants. Old men reached with trembling hands. The soldiers who had spent years carrying rifles and grenades now found themselves doing something far more important. Handing food to a woman who weighed almost nothing. Giving a chocolate bar to a child who had never tasted candy. For one little boy in Haarlem, the memory was simple. His family had survived on boiled tulip bulbs. He had never had candy. Then a Canadian soldier gave him something sweet. There were thousands of children like him, tens of thousands. An entire generation whose first memory of kindness after occupation was not a speech, not a flag, not a military parade. It was food in the hand of a stranger wearing a Canadian uniform. That is why this story lasted. Because in a world where families had eaten pets, burned furniture for warmth, and traded wedding rings for potatoes, a biscuit could feel like mercy. The convoys kept moving. May the 2nd, May 3rd, May 4th, May 5th. On May 5th, General Charles Foulkes accepted the surrender of German forces in the Netherlands at Wageningen, but Operation Faust did not stop. The Germans had surrendered. The hunger had not. 3 million people still needed food, so the trucks kept going. Canadian vehicles remained on relief missions long after the Somme. Military victory was official. They drove deeper into neighborhoods that had been cut off for months. They reached families who had not even known the war was over because they no longer had the strength to go outside. The drivers of the Royal Canadian Army Service Corps did not win glory through gunfire in Western Holland. They were not taking hills. They were not storming beaches. They were not crossing rivers under artillery. They were driving food, and in those days, that saved more lives than many combat operations. Operations Manna, Chowhound, and Faust together are believed to have helped save around 1 million Dutch people from starvation. 1 million lives. But the most important part of this story is not found in supply records, not in tonnage, not in convoy schedules, not in aircraft counts. It is found in what happened afterward, because when the war ended, the Dutch did not simply say thank you and move on. They remembered, not as nations usually remember, but as families remember. In the weeks after surrender, roughly 170,000 Canadian soldiers remained in the Netherlands waiting to go home. The fighting was over. The war in Europe had ended. Most of them wanted only one thing: a ship back across the Atlantic. But while they waited, something happened that no commander ordered. Dutch families opened their doors. They welcomed Canadian soldiers into their homes. They shared what little food they had. They introduced them to relatives, neighbors, daughters, communities. The Canadians were not seen as occupiers, not as strangers to tolerate, but as people who had arrived when everything seemed lost. The Dutch had lived for 5 years under occupation. They had seen brutality, hunger, fear, and humiliation. Many Dutchmen had been taken for forced labor. Families had been broken. Trust had been destroyed. Then came these young soldiers from Canada. They were tired, yes. Many had been hardened by war, but they were also friendly, generous, often from farms and small towns. They played with children, helped repair homes, shared cigarettes, chocolate, and stories, and many Dutch women noticed them. After years of occupation, the Canadians seemed alive in a way the country had almost forgotten. Young, healthy, smiling, human. Nearly 1,100 Dutch women married Canadian soldiers. Some of those marriages began in ruined cities and hungry villages, in the strange space between war and peace. One Dutch woman who had endured occupation met a Canadian soldier and crossed the Atlantic to begin a new life in a country she had never seen. Stories like hers were repeated again and again. The bond between Canada and the Netherlands was not created only by politicians. It was created in kitchens, in letters, in weddings, in children born from families that began because one army came to liberate and stayed long enough to be loved. But the bond was not built only on love. It was built on graves. More than 7,000 Canadians died during the campaign to liberate the Netherlands. Soldiers, sailors, airmen. They are buried in cemeteries across the country. At Groesbeek, near Nijmegen, thousands of Canadian graves stand in rows of white headstones. At Holten, more than 1,000 Canadians rest in a cemetery surrounded by forest. And what the Dutch do at these cemeteries is unlike almost anything else in Europe. They adopt the graves. Dutch schoolchildren learn the names of Canadian soldiers they never met. They study where they came from, their age, their regiment, their hometown. They learn that a young man from Saskatchewan or Ontario or Nova Scotia died in April 1945, sometimes not far from the place where their own grandparents lived. Then they bring flowers. Not once, year after year, generation after generation. A child grows up, and another child takes their place. The dead are not left alone. At Holton on Christmas Eve, the community gathers in the dark. Families bring candles and place them at the graves, one candle for each soldier. The cemetery glows in the winter night, and the town stands silent. This is not ordinary remembrance. It is personal. It is a promise. France has memorials. Belgium has ceremonies. But in the Netherlands, Canadian sacrifice became part of family memory, a debt carried by names, graves, flowers, and children who are taught that freedom was bought for them by people from far away. Why is this bond so different? Why do Dutch people still weep when Canadian veterans return? Why do they still treat the liberation not as an old chapter in a history book, but as something alive? The answer is simple. Because the Canadians arrived at the exact moment when freedom and survival became the same thing. They did not only defeat the enemy, they fed the hungry. They did not only raise flags, they handed food to children. They did not only open roads, they opened the future. And then came the tulips. During the war, while Canadian soldiers fought across Europe, Crown Princess Juliana of the Netherlands lived in Canada. She had fled the German invasion in 1940 with her daughters. Britain offered shelter, but London was under attack. Canada became a safer refuge. Juliana settled in Ottawa. She lived there for years, walked the streets, attended church, raised her children, and was treated not only as royalty in exile, but as a neighbor. On January 19, 1943, she gave birth to her third daughter at the Ottawa Civic Hospital. The Canadian government made a remarkable legal decision. It temporarily declared the maternity ward outside Canadian sovereignty, so the baby would hold only Dutch citizenship and remain eligible in the Dutch royal line. The child was named Margaret, a name connected to the daisy, a flower that symbolized resistance in occupied Holland. When the Netherlands was liberated and Juliana returned home, she sent Canada a gift, 100,000 tulip bulbs. They were planted in Ottawa, along the Rideau Canal and near Parliament Hill. When they bloomed, they turned gratitude into color. A river of flowers in the capital of the country that had sheltered the Dutch royal family and helped liberate the Dutch people. Then more tulips came, and more, year after year. The tradition never stopped. Every spring, tulips bloom in Ottawa as a living thank you from the Netherlands to Canada. And the symbolism is almost impossible to ignore. The tulip bulb was what desperate Dutch families ate during the hunger winter. The tulip bulb was survival at the lowest point. And after liberation, the tulip became gratitude. The same object, one meaning in starvation, another in freedom. The Dutch took the flower that reminded them of hunger and transformed it into a gift for the nation that helped end the hunger. That is why the tulips matter. They are not just flowers. They are memory growing out of the ground. Farley Mowat survived the war. He became a writer and told stories for the rest of his life. He never forgot the absurd and dangerous jeep ride through German lines, though his retellings changed with time, personality, and probably a few glasses of whiskey. He died in 2014 at the age of 92. Lisbeth, the little girl made an honorary captain by Canadian signalmen, lived a long life. Decades later, she still remembered the soldiers who had treated her with kindness during liberation. The blue sweater with the Canadian insignia survived too, not as fabric, as proof. Proof that an army can leave behind more than ruins. Proof that kindness can outlive war. And Herb Pike, the young sergeant who entered Apeldoorn and saw faces he could never forget, returned to the Netherlands decades later. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of liberation, Canadian veterans came back. They were no longer young men in uniform. They were elderly, many walking slowly, carrying memories most people could never understand. In Apeldoorn, tens of thousands of Dutch people filled the streets to welcome them. For the veterans, it was overwhelming. They had expected respect. They found love. The Dutch were not simply honoring a military victory. They were greeting people they considered part of their national family. Pike later said that the Dutch truly never forgot what the Canadians did, and they proved it every time the veterans returned. So what did the Canadians find in Holland? They found a nation on the edge of death. They found people eating flowers to survive. They found children too weak to play, mothers too hungry to cry, old men too exhausted to stand. They found cities where silence had replaced daily life. And they did something simple. They gave what they had, from aircraft, from trucks, from ration packs, from pockets, one sack of flour, one tin of meat, one chocolate bar, one life at a time. It was not only military strategy, it was not just logistics, it was human decency delivered under a white flag. And 80 years later, the tulips still bloom, not because the Dutch forgot the hunger, but because they remembered who came when hunger was winning. Thank you for watching this story all the way through. That matters, not just for this channel, but for the soldiers, families, and civilians whose stories deserve to survive. If this story moved you, leave a like so more people can remember what happened in the Netherlands in 1945. If you are not subscribed yet, subscribe and turn on the bell for more powerful true stories from history. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And did someone in your family serve during the Second World War? Canadian, Dutch, American, British, Australian, or any allied nation, write their story below. Because history only stays alive when people keep telling it.